I never told my fiancé that I own the company he works for. He always complained about upper management at dinner. One night, he asked me to attend his office gala as his plus one. I agreed, but when the CEO stepped onto the stage and my name appeared on the screen, before I proceed to unravel how it all happened, kindly like and subscribe so you will be notified when we upload new stories that will continue to interest you. The CEO walked onto that stage. The screen lit up behind her, and there, in letters 3 feet tall, was my name, Claire Bennett. I felt Marcus's hand go stiff in mine. Then he turned to look at me. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood what I was seeing. The ballroom lights were low. The screen was bright. It could have been an award slide, a donor acknowledgement, something ceremonial. But the words beneath my name made it clear. Founder and principal owner. The room went quiet in that subtle way large rooms do when something unexpected lands. A few forks paused midair. A glass touched down too carefully on a table. Marcus leaned slightly toward me. "What is this?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I didn't answer immediately. My eyes stayed on the stage. Caroline Whitmore, the public-facing CEO I had appointed 8 years earlier, adjusted the microphone. "Tonight," she said evenly, "we correct a misunderstanding that has existed inside this company for a long time." The slide shifted. Financial growth charts appeared, facility expansion timelines, headcount progression from 17 employees to 412. I knew those numbers by memory. "This company did not emerge from private equity," Caroline continued. "It did not originate from a corporate acquisition. It was rebuilt from insolvency by one person." My name remained above her shoulder, Claire Bennett. Marcus's hand slowly withdrew from mine. He had spent the last 2 years telling me about upper management, about how they made decisions from glass offices, about how whoever owned the company either didn't know what was happening on the floor or didn't care. He never imagined he had been saying those things to me. I stood when Caroline said my name again. The spotlight found me quickly. I could feel the shift ripple across the room as people recognized me, not as a guest, not as someone's partner, but as the owner. I walked toward the stage with a steady pace. My heels made a measured sound against the marble floor. Caroline met me halfway up the steps. "It's time," she said quietly. I nodded. She turned back to the room. Claire Bennett inherited this company's debt at 26 years old. Over 12 years, she rebuilt it into the operation you stand in today. There was no dramatic tone in her voice, just fact. 412 employees, 3 facilities, 0 missed payrolls in a decade. Applause began, uncertain at first, then stronger as understanding settled. From the stage, I could see Marcus clearly now. He wasn't clapping. He was staring at me in a way I had never seen before. Not anger, not confusion, calculation, reassembly, replaying conversations in his head. Caroline handed me the microphone. I hadn't prepared a speech. This wasn't a celebration, it was a correction. "Most of you don't know me," I said. My voice sounded steady in the speakers. That was intentional. A few quiet murmurs. "I've listened closely over the years, to feedback, to concerns, to the people who keep this place running." I paused briefly. "And some of what I've heard matters." That was all I said. I handed the microphone back. The applause this time was measured, respectful, not explosive. When I stepped down from the stage, I didn't return to table 19. Marcus was still seated when I passed the row. He didn't reach for me. As I moved toward the front seating area prepared for executive leadership, I felt my phone vibrate in my clutch. One message. "We need to talk." No punctuation. I didn't respond. Because the truth was, we had been talking for 2 years. He just hadn't known who he was talking to. If you only saw that stage, you would assume I had always stood in front of rooms like that. I hadn't. When my father's logistics firm collapsed, I was 26 and still finishing a certification program in supply chain management. The business didn't fail dramatically. It thinned out. Contracts weren't renewed, payments were delayed, equipment leases piled up. By the time he admitted it wasn't recoverable, the debt had already outgrown the revenue. When he died 6 months later, I inherited invoices, not assets. The bank representative who called me didn't ask whether I planned to take over. He asked how I planned to settle outstanding balances. So I asked for time. I sold 2 trucks. I kept 1 small warehouse. I called former clients myself. Some didn't answer. A few did. 3 agreed to short-term contracts with strict performance clauses. I worked 14-hour days the first year. I handled dispatch in the morning and reconciled accounts at night. I negotiated with suppliers who assumed I wouldn't last. I learned which line items in a contract were flexible and which weren't. There was nothing glamorous about rebuilding it, no sudden turnaround, just gradual stabilization. By year 5, we had 50 employees. By year 8, over 200. At year 12, just over 400 across 3 facilities. I kept my lifestyle modest on purpose. I drove a sedan that was reliable and forgettable. I lived in a comfortable house, but nothing that drew attention. The company carried my father's name publicly. My name stayed in legal documents and board filings. I separated my identity from the business deliberately. In my early 30s, I had dated someone who found out about my net worth 6 months in. Within weeks, conversations changed. He deferred to me in small decisions that had nothing to do with money. It felt artificial. The relationship ended quietly. After that, I stopped volunteering information. I wasn't hiding it to manipulate anyone. I was trying to remove the distortion money creates. I met Marcus at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning. He was standing in front of a produce stand explaining, calmly, that if the sign said local, it should actually mean local. He wasn't loud, he wasn't dramatic, he was precise. We ended up in line for coffee together. He apologized for being overly particular. I told him I respected it. He worked as an operations floor supervisor at a regional logistics company. He spoke about safety checks and training cycles the way other people talk about hobbies. There was pride in it, but not ego. He never asked detailed questions about what I did. When he did ask, I kept it general. Operations consulting, I said. It was accurate enough. We dated for months before he mentioned the company by name. It was mine. I didn't react. I asked which facility, which shift, how long he'd been there. He had worked his way up over 8 years, started on the floor, took certification courses on his own time, earned his supervisor role. I admired that. What drew me to him most was how seriously he took fairness. He believed leadership should understand the work, not just the reports. He believed safety budgets should never be optional. Those values mattered to him. They mattered to me too. The tension began, quietly at the dinner table. It became a pattern. He would come home tired, loosen his tie, sit across from me, and talk. Upper management approved a new workflow nobody on the floor was consulted about, he said one evening. 3 guys nearly got hurt trying to meet the new load times. I poured him wine and asked what he thought should change. They should spend 1 week on the floor before signing anything, he said. You can't design systems from a spreadsheet. Another night, it was about maintenance. They cut equipment servicing again. It saves money on paper. In 6 months, it'll cost more in breakdowns. I asked if he'd escalated it. I have. It goes nowhere. Then, one evening, after a particularly long shift, he leans back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Whoever runs this company either doesn't know what's happening down there or doesn't care. Neither one is good. I remember that sentence clearly. I didn't correct him, I didn't defend myself, I just listened. Because part of what he was saying was true. As the company grew, layers formed between leadership and the floor. Managers filtered information. Budget proposals became abstracted into spreadsheets and projections. I reviewed reports, I approved capital allocations, but I was no longer present in the daily friction. Listening to Marcus wasn't painful because he was wrong. It was painful because he was partially right. And every night I chose not to tell him. I told myself I would explain eventually, that once the relationship was stable enough, I would bring him into that part of my life. But the longer I waited, the more complicated it became. Because his frustration was sincere, his criticism was rooted in principle, and those principles were the reason I loved him. The same principles that would make the truth feel like a betrayal. The secret didn't collapse overnight. It accumulated. There were moments, small, ordinary ones, when I almost told him. The first was after a policy revision I had approved 6 months earlier. It was a liability adjustment. Insurance premiums had climbed after 2 minor injuries in 1 quarter. Our advisors recommended tightening workflow protocols and reducing overtime overlap in certain zones. On paper, it was the responsible decision. The rollout was clumsy. Middle management implemented it without floor consultation. Marcus came home angry in a way I hadn't seen before. Not loud, focused. They restructured load sequencing again, he said, dropping his keys on the counter. Nobody on the floor was consulted. They cut overlap shifts to save on exposure. I knew the language. Exposure. He sat down heavily. Do they understand what that does in real time? 3 guys were trying to clear Dock 6 by themselves. I opened my mouth. I could have explained the insurance pressure, the legal counsel's warning, the actuarial report that projected a 12% premium spike if we didn't adjust protocols. But how do you explain that the decision he hated was yours? I closed my mouth. What would you have done differently? I asked instead. He answered with specifics, adjustments that, in hindsight, had merit. That night, after he fell asleep, I emailed the operations VP and asked for a floor-level review of the rollout. I didn't sign it personally. I never did. The second almost moment came when a supervisor named Daniel was let go. Marcus respected Daniel. They had worked together for years. They fired him, Marcus said one evening, staring at his plate. No warning, just gone. There had been warnings, 3 documented performance reviews, 2 final notices, an incident involving falsified maintenance logs that could have exposed us legally. I knew every detail. He's got 2 kids, Marcus continued. If leadership spent more time talking to people instead of auditing them, maybe it wouldn't get to this point. I felt the weight of what I knew pressing against the inside of my chest. I could have told him the full record, the disciplinary file, the safety violation that could have shut down an entire shift. But that would require explaining how I had access to that file. So I said nothing. I asked how Daniel was holding up. I listened as Marcus described the floor's reaction. And later that week, I asked HR to review how termination communications were handled at the supervisory level. He never knew. The third moment was the one I remember most clearly. We were cleaning up after dinner. He dried dishes while I rinsed. "You know," he said casually, "I respect whoever built this company. There's vision there. You can see it in the structure." I waited. "They just don't think they're in the trenches anymore." The words landed softly, not accusing, observational. I felt my throat tighten. I excused myself and walked to the bathroom. I locked the door and stood in front of the sink. I gripped the edges and looked at myself in the mirror. Who exactly was I protecting at that point? Him? Myself? The version of us that existed without imbalance? I told myself again that I would explain soon, that it needed to be timed correctly, that honesty delivered badly can feel like betrayal even if it's overdue. The timing never materialized. He proposed 3 months later. It was quiet. We were at home, no audience, no photographer hidden behind a plant. He cooked dinner, overcooked the salmon slightly, and after we cleared the table, he reached into his jacket pocket. "I don't want a big life," he said. "I just want a steady one, with you." He knelt, not dramatically, just sincerely. For one brief second, everything felt clean, simple. I thought, this is the moment. I could tell him before I answer. I could reset the foundation before we build on it. Instead, I said yes. I told myself I would explain after the engagement settled, after the holidays, after the board finalized the quarterly review, after something. The right moment never appeared. That winter, the company hit a difficult quarter. Fuel costs rose, 2 regional contracts underperformed. We were forced into decisions I had hoped to avoid, a hiring freeze and a departmental restructure designed to streamline reporting chains. I signed off on the internal memo announcing it. 3 days later, Marcus came home tight with frustration. "They announced a restructure today," he said, his voice sharper than usual. "Nobody asked us anything. We found out in an email." "An email, Claire?" I heard it twice, once as his fiancé, once as the person who had approved the language in that message. "It's like we don't exist," he continued. "Decisions just drop from above." I sat across from him and felt something inside me compress. I wasn't a villain in this story. I wasn't indifferent. I knew the payroll numbers. I knew what would happen if we didn't act quickly. I knew how thin the margin had become that quarter. But he didn't see that layer. He saw impact. And I saw both. It began to feel like living in dual exposure, 2 images overlaid slightly out of alignment. Then the gala invitation arrived. He mentioned it casually at first. "The annual company gala's coming up," he said one evening. "They're making it a bigger deal this year. CEO's supposed to make a rare appearance." I felt a slow tightening in my chest. "They nominated me for floor supervisor of the year," he added, almost reluctant to sound proud. "I don't know if I'll win, but it's something." He looked at me carefully. "I want you there," he said. "I want you to see what I actually do, where I actually come from." There it was. The crisis didn't unfold dramatically. It unfolded in quiet calculation. I couldn't send a representative in my place. This was the first formal introduction of the principal owner to the full staff body, a transition the board had been pushing for years. I couldn't skip the event entirely. Marcus would notice. He would be hurt. I couldn't warn him without explaining everything, and I still hadn't found the courage to do that without destabilizing us. I told myself, maybe it won't come up. Maybe Caroline will keep it general. Maybe I can sit at his table, clap politely, and slip out early. I genuinely believed that was possible. He watched me, waiting. "Of course I'll be there," I said. And in that moment, I sealed the timing of everything that followed. I almost canceled twice. The first time was an hour before we were supposed to leave. I stood in my bedroom, holding the invitation, reading the embossed lettering like it might change if I stared at it long enough. I could have sent a message to Caroline, claimed fatigue, claimed travel. The board would have understood. We had postponed my formal introduction before, but Marcus wouldn't have understood. The second time was when I was fastening the clasp of my dress. It was navy, structured, understated, elegant, but not attention-grabbing. Even then, I was trying to disappear into the room. I had my phone in my hand. I typed out a message to him while he was downstairs. "We need to talk before tonight." I erased it. When I came down, he was in the hallway adjusting his tie in the mirror. He straightened it, stepped back, then adjusted it again. I had never seen him look that proud. "Nervous?" I asked. A little, he admitted, smiling. It's stupid. It's not, I said. He looked at me with that steady warmth that had always made things feel simple. I want you there, he said. I want you to see what I actually do, where I actually come from. In the car, he talked about his team, about the quarter they'd had, about how recognition mattered to people who rarely got it. I almost told him then. I turned slightly toward him. Marcus, there's something The valet line came into view. Headlights, attendants opening doors. We pulled up. The moment closed. Inside, the ballroom was already full. Round tables, soft lighting, glassware catching reflections from the chandeliers. Employees from all 3 facilities, supervisors, floor leads, department managers, people who, several layers up on an organizational chart, ultimately reported to me. Marcus introduced me around with easy confidence. This is Claire, he said. She's in operations consulting. I smiled and shook hands, listened to stories about dock schedules and overtime shifts. Halfway through the reception, I felt a familiar awareness, the sense of being recognized. Elliot Ramirez had just entered from the side corridor. As senior VP, he had been pushing for my formal introduction to staff for years. When his eyes landed on me, his expression changed almost imperceptibly. Recognition, then concern. I gave him the smallest shake of my head. He understood immediately and adjusted his expression. A junior manager tilted her head at me a few minutes later. You look familiar, she said. Have we met before? I doubt it, I replied lightly. I work mostly off-site. She nodded and moved on. A few minutes after that, Elliot began walking toward our table. I excused myself before he reached us. Claire, he said under his breath, I didn't know you'd be seated. Please, I interrupted gently, not tonight. I'll explain tomorrow. He hesitated, then nodded. When I returned to the table, Marcus was mid-conversation about load targets. He didn't notice the exchange. I was performing 2 roles at once, and I could feel how thin the line was becoming. Dinner began. Plates were cleared. The program moved forward. When they announced the nominees for Floor Supervisor of the Year, Marcus sat up straighter. I reached for his hand beneath the tablecloth. And the award goes to Marcus Hale. The applause around us was immediate and genuine. He looked stunned for half a second before standing. I watched him walk to the stage with that same measured pace he had when we first met, steady, grounded. He accepted the plaque awkwardly. I don't do speeches, he began, earning a small laugh, but this belongs to my team. They show up, they do the work, they make sure people get home safe. He spoke about fairness, about communication, about leadership listening. I watched him and felt a clean, uncomplicated pride. He was everything I had fallen for, standing right there. When he returned to the table, he squeezed my hand. That wasn't terrible, he said. It was good. It was honest. The MC returned to the microphone. To close the evening, she said, we are honored to introduce, for the first time at an all-staff event, the founder and chief executive officer of this company. Marcus leaned back slightly, curious. Didn't know they were doing that, he said quietly. The lights dimmed. A short video began to play. Early warehouse footage, my father's original sign, the first small team photo. Then the growth years, expanded facilities, increased headcount. Marcus watched, relaxed, interested. I knew exactly what was coming. It is my honor, the MC continued, to introduce Claire Bennett, founder and chief executive officer. The screen behind the stage lit up. My full name, my photo, my title. The room applauded. Marcus didn't. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared at the screen. And then, slowly, he turned to look at me. The expression wasn't explosive, it wasn't dramatic, it was something quieter, a recalculation. I stood. The walk to the stage felt longer than it should have. The applause was steady, respectful. I took the microphone. Good evening, I said. My voice was composed, warm. I spoke about rebuilding from debt, about employees who stayed during hard years, about growth that required difficult decisions, about accountability. I thanked supervisors by role, not by name. I didn't look directly at Marcus, but I could see him in my peripheral vision, perfectly still. When I finished, the applause rose again. I stepped down and returned to the table. He hadn't shifted. He picked up his water glass and finished it slowly, deliberately, as if he needed something steady to focus on. Then he set it down carefully. Without raising his voice, without looking at me, he asked, "How long?" The ride home was silent. Not the kind of silence where someone is searching for words, the kind where words would only make things worse. I tried once. Marcus? Not yet. 2 words. Calm. Controlled. I gave him that. The city lights moved across the windshield in steady patterns. The driver kept his eyes forward. Marcus stared out the passenger window the entire way. His hands were folded in his lap, not clenched, just still. When we pulled into the driveway, he stepped out before I could reach for him. Inside, the house felt exactly as it had that morning. Same lighting, same quiet hum of the refrigerator. Nothing about it reflected what had just happened. He walked straight to the kitchen and sat down at the table. The same table where he had spent 2 years telling me everything he thought about my company. I remained standing for a moment, then took the chair across from him. He didn't look at me immediately. "How long?" he asked. There was no anger in his voice, just weight. "Since before we met," I said. "I've owned it the entire time." He nodded once, slowly. "Every complaint I made about that place," he said, staring at the table surface. "Every time I came home frustrated, every time I trusted you with that, you already knew." "Yes." He exhaled through his nose. "You let me look like a fool." "I never meant to." "That's not the point." He finally looked at me. His eyes weren't sharp. They were tired. "I wasn't embarrassed. He paused, searching. "I just keep thinking about every single conversation we had at this table." "So did I." "I kept waiting for the right time," I said, "and it never came." He leaned back slightly, absorbing that. "I didn't tell you because of money," I continued. "In the past, once people knew, something changed. They either treated me differently or they treated themselves differently around me. I needed to know you loved me without that in the room." He listened, but he didn't interrupt. "I never lied to you," I said, "but I let you not know the truth, and I understand that's the same thing." He was quiet for a long time after that. "You let me build opinions about you," he said finally, "about leadership, about fairness. You let me criticize you without knowing it." "Yes. And you just sat there." "I listened," I said, "and I took it seriously." He stood then, pushing the chair back slowly, not abruptly. "I need space," he said. He didn't leave the house. He walked down the hallway to the spare room and closed the door. I stayed at the table. The house was silent again, but different now. I sat there until the sun came up. I thought about every dinner, every complaint, every time he had handed me his trust without knowing he was doing it. And I thought about how I had held it, quietly, carefully, and whether holding it quietly was the same as throwing it away. He didn't speak much the next day. We moved around each other with caution, polite, measured. On the third evening, he came back to the kitchen table. I was already there. He sat down across from me. He asked, "I have one question," he said. I waited. "Did any of my complaints ever actually change anything?" It wasn't accusatory, it was something else. Verification. "Yes," I said. He didn't blink. "The maintenance budget you mentioned in February, I had it reviewed and reinstated within the month. The workflow adjustment you were furious about, we revised the rollout after feedback from the floor. The restructure email, I rewrote the communication protocol for the next one." He absorbed that quietly. Long pause. He didn't smile, but something in his face shifted, like a door that hadn't been fully closed. "We didn't fix it in a week. We didn't pretend it was fine either. Counseling was his suggestion, not dramatic, not emotional, practical. If we're going to stay in this," he said, "we need someone who isn't either of us." So we found someone. A quiet office with neutral walls and a clock that ticked softly behind us. In those sessions, Marcus spoke carefully, not with anger, with precision. "The hardest part," he said once, "wasn't that you were the CEO. It was that I gave you something every night at that table. I gave you what I really thought, and you didn't give me the same." That stayed with me. He wasn't describing money or power. He was describing exposure. I had asked him what he thought should change. I had asked how he would fix things. I had encouraged him to be candid, and all the while I had withheld the one piece of information that would have made those conversations equal. In counseling, I began dismantling the separation I had built between my identity and my relationships. I had told myself it was protection, a way to ensure love wasn't influenced by status. But protection, stretched too far, becomes isolation, and isolation, sustained long enough, becomes deception. Marcus needed time, not just to process what I had hidden, but to reconcile it with the evidence that I had listened, that the maintenance budget had been reinstated, that safety revisions had been implemented, that the restructure language had changed because of what he said at dinner. It complicated his anger. He eventually left the company, not in protest, not dramatically, but because the reporting structure had become untenable. He couldn't supervise within a chain that ultimately led to me, not after everything was known. He found a role elsewhere, still operations, still floor-focused, the same values. When he told me, I felt two things at once, relief and something like grief. The company had been a bridge between us and a barrier at the same time. I also had to be honest with myself. Part of me had been testing him. I wanted to know if he would love me without knowing what I had built, if he would choose me when there was nothing impressive attached to my name. That wasn't fair to him either. He hadn't asked to be part of an experiment. The engagement held, but it wasn't the same engagement. We rebuilt it deliberately, slower, with conversations that were less polished. I told him things I had previously kept separate: board pressure, quarterly stress, the fear of making a decision that would affect hundreds of families. He told me when he felt small in a room, when he felt proud, when he felt uncertain. We still got married, but we got married as two people who had actually met each other. When I think back on it now, I don't think I'm a bad person. I think I made a bad choice and kept making it because every day I didn't tell him made it harder to tell him. Secrets don't stay small. They grow into the shape of whatever you're most afraid to lose. I was afraid that if he knew, he would love me differently. What I didn't understand was that withholding the truth also changes how someone loves you. It shifts the ground slightly, even if they don't know why. The truth, delivered badly and late, still did less damage than the version of me that sat silent at that table for 2 years. If I could redo anything, it wouldn't be the company. It would be that first dinner when he said, "Whoever runs this place either knows or doesn't care." I would have said, calmly, "I know," and then I would have let him see me. When I tell this story now, I don't tell it as victory. The company survived, the relationship survived, but survival and ease are not the same thing. There are still moments, small ones, when I see Marcus pause before sharing something work-related, just for half a second. Not because he doesn't trust me, but because we both remember what silence can do. And I remember the version of myself who believed that withholding the truth was safer than risking rejection. It wasn't safer, it was quieter, and quiet can feel safe until it isn't. So here's what I genuinely want to know from you. Was I wrong for keeping that secret, or was the fear behind it something you understand? Was Marcus right to feel betrayed, or does the reason matter at all? I'm not asking for sympathy, I'm asking for perspective. Tell me your verdict, and if this story made you think, even a little, like the video, subscribe, and stay with me. I read every single comment.